Before we get started this morning, there's just three little cautions, or three things I just want to say off the bat. First is one, as I'm going to give you just enough information to be dangerous, right? My goal this morning is to just raise awareness about abuse, what it looks like, and help you see trends. I cannot teach you in the time that I have to engage with it safely, right? And so just be aware of what you leave here, of what you still don't know, and get consult and help and things like that when you encounter it. Secondly, I will talk primarily about women as victims because it is primarily what I have seen. That's what's primarily in our churches. 90% of the cases are where there is a female victim. However, I have counseled male victims of domestic abuse. They are real, they are out there, and the stigma for them is far greater. So we want to have a higher sensitivity of that. I just find when I'm speaking, it's clumsy to go back and forth between pronouns. And lastly, I just want to say this. I do a lot of training. I train seminary students. I have pastors calling to do consults with me quite frequently when they've been counseling in their churches. And I've trained young counselors. And most of the time, wherever I go, there is someone who, like myself, encountered abuse and they did not know it. They offered advice that was terrible. I have done that. They just didn't understand the dynamics into which their counsel they were giving. And so I just want to say to you all, I have been there. That's how I've learned this material, is by sitting with victims and sitting with oppressors. And I have made lots of mistakes. And one thing that's just been true to me, good truth that has helped me, is that the Lord is faithful. And he is the great shepherd when I fail his people. And so if any of you are just hearing this, and I'm sure somebody's going to be sitting here, a case, a woman or somebody's going to pop into their head, just know that the Lord has the person that you now fear that you might have failed. Just think it's just really helpful. So I just want to spend a little bit of time just backing up and thinking, how do we even think about abuse? And to do that, we have to go back even further, thinking about how do we understand marriage, relationships, etc., etc. And I think it's just helpful to recognize just the basics of our faith, right? We were created to worship God and others. I'm sorry, I'm a slide ahead of you already. Right? When we worship our Creator, when he is the object of our desires, we delight in him and we enjoy him and we are like him. And any times our desires point away from him, bad things happen. We easily manufacture these other idols that lead us astray. And the way we love other people really reveals how we love the Lord. And so this is just going to be exposed. Marriage, you don't even have to be married to know being in a relationship exposes our hearts in unique ways. We all know, again, that we all have these healthy desires, and it's just really easy in our humanness and our fallenness for the descent of a desire. Ed Welch talks a lot, counselor that I work with, about just the descent of a desire and how easily we get in trouble. I want children. I want to be married. I want my children to be well behaved, right? When that becomes a want or a need or something that I demand, then my desire becomes ugly and it's something that I worship. And so when we're looking at abuse, we're actually going further down in that descent to the point where I will wound and punish someone to get my way. So we're actually in the sub-basement of a desire. And another thing I want us to be thinking about is how we approach people in ministry. We are tasked with bringing the right passage to the right person at the right moment in time. And Mike Emlett's work on this, another colleague of mine, has just been really helpful. When we encounter people, we are encountering a sufferer, a saint, and a sinner. And that is true in abuse work. And when I talk about victims, I'm definitely be talking them through the lens of suffering first. Do I know that they're a sinner? Yes. Do I appeal to their faith? Yes. But they need me at first to notice the extent of their suffering. The same is true of an oppressor. His way that he is choosing to sin first has to get my attention. That does not mean I do not care or minister to his suffering or appeal to his heart in the Lord. right? So we're doing that when I'm working with abuse ministry. You're doing that when you're encountering friends or congregants. The only difference abuse really puts on the scene is the need to think about safety in those dimensions, because the sins that are happening make the situation where the people are living dangerous, right? So I'm really not doing anything different that we all do in ministry. It's just bringing an awareness to the level of danger, the level of ensnaredness, and how sinister these particular sins are of oppressors. So I just want to think really quickly, again, marriage, it's wonderful. I'm married to a wonderful man. I would not be here. He supports me in so many sweet and tender ways. But just knowing, this blows my mind. I say it every time I talk. But when God designed marriage, he already had Christ in the church in mind. I can't even imagine that, right? Just the beautiful picture that that's meant to be. And so one of the beautiful pictures or purposes of marriage is to picture the relationship between Christ and his redeemed people forever. What a glorious thing, right? And we think about that. How does Jesus relate to us? He is faithful. He is sacrificing. He's accepting. He's honoring. He's serving. He's honest and caring. Well, abuse is the antithesis. I've heard yesterday we need to use that word more, right? Of all of that, it's the exact opposite of who Jesus is. It's a complete and utter distortion of the marriage. Right, we look at someone who is faithless, who is taking from the relationship. They are rejecting, dishonoring, selfish, dishonest, and cruel. That is not the picture, friends, of what a marriage should be. When we're talking about abuse in marriage, right, we're going to look in a second about certain idolatries in marriage. It's a specific idolatry that I want you to understand before you leave today. And yet at the same time, we all are idolaters in our own marriage, right? I'm married to an idol worshiper, and it hurts us, right? It's costly. Our own idols harm our spouses. I can think about, I have an idol of comfort, right? I homeschool. At the end of the day, I want my husband home and I want a break, right? And I could totally take advantage of his willingness to sacrifice and to serve me. And I need to be careful, right? And so I think it's just, we're aware, like again, in relationship, there is this dynamic going on. But I just am here to point out a caution that not all sin is the same. And sometimes we have placed too much cause and effect in a marriage, or too much pressure on the institution of marriage to address certain sin patterns, right? Because if I'm married to an idolater or a pornographer or somebody with a gambling issue, or if I was a shopaholic, right? There is certain sins that control the climate of a marriage. And I might respond to my husband's pornography use sinfully, but there's nothing I can do that would cause him to stop sinning. That's between him and the Lord, right? And so I think it's just really helpful to remember there's some sins that we really need to take inventory of. And the Westminster Confession of Faith does this beautifully in 150 and 151. When you have time, look it up. But it just really just talks about not all sin is the same, and not all sin does the same damage. And I wish I had time to read them here, but they are beautifully written, and they really speak well to the particular sins of abuse. So what is it, Darby? You're saying there's this idolatry in marriage. We all have it. So what makes abuse different? It's a really hard question to answer. There isn't this line I can give you and say this is abuse and this isn't abuse. We want to be really careful. Calling or labeling someone abusive when they are not does damage of a different kind, right? Not just to the individual who is labeled that, but also to the next victim coming forward in that environment. So what I'm hoping to do is train you to be very sensitive and accurate, but more than anything, just curious, right? I want to train you to be curious so that you're good listeners when you have people in front of you who are coming forward and saying, do I really understand the whole story? And one way to understand abuse is to understand the unique idolatries that drive it, right? Abusers have two sets of systems that are really helpful to understand. And the first is that in how they relate to other people. They are entitled people through and through. And so they want their world the way they want it, right? I've heard things, I don't want to be talked to when the game's on. I don't want dog hair on the couch. I don't want to have to babysit my children when you go out to lunch with a friend. I get to have the huge screen TV. You get to go thrift shopping for your clothes, right? Their world is about them. They also are people who tend to dominate in relationships. Your friends make me uncomfortable. I don't want to spend time at your family for Christmas, right? They have all these things that they enforce in the relationship. And then they will threaten other people to keep their world the way they want it, right? If you don't keep the house clean next time you show up, there might not be money at the grocery store after you've gone grocery shopping. That's happened to so many women that I care for. They fail in some way and they go with their 3 kids to the grocery aisle and they get there and the debit card's now empty. Well, now you know how I feel when you let me down. If you don't do this for me, I'm going to tell the pastor about your sexual past before we were married. If you keep nagging me about that, we will never go to your families for Christmas again. Right? Horrific ways that they threaten their spouse. In a sense, I say oppressive people kind of enslave other people, which is really the opposite of Jesus' love, right? Self-sacrificial. But even worse is they have these sets of self-deceptions, and this is when we come in and when we're trying to work with them, this is where we can really see it play out. We don't always see the abuse in the home, but when we're beginning to challenge them, we can see these attitudes come out. They typically are very blind to the harm that they are doing. They might say to me, yeah, Darby, I know, I threw the mug at her, right? They know the mug left their hand. But they will say, but I had no other way to get her attention. They are blind that their behavior is a problem. Other oppressors are just totally blind and have a hard time understanding it. They really don't see a problem with their sin at all. And Ed Welsh would say an angry person is the last one to know, right? There's something so self-righteous about anger. We can understand that at some level. But it's really frightening, the level of blindness. Secondly, is they really lack remorse for other people. And so we think about, oftentimes a pastor will call in a couple and a husband will be caught. I can think of an extreme case. Pastor called me up, couple came in, he had choked his wife. And pastor, he didn't want the wife to call the police because he'd lose his job. He sat there, big crocodile tears, prayerfully. Not prayerfully, I shouldn't say prayerfully, just so sorrowful. And the pastor said to me, well, he was very sorry. I said, he was sorry because he was caught. He was sorry because he was embarrassed. He was sorry for the consequences he was going to face. Did you ask him how that impacted his wife? No. Did he talk about how it frightened her? No. Did he say he was so afraid that he would do that again to get him help? No. Then he wasn't really have godly sorrow. He had worldly sorrow, right? And they're master blame shifters. So we see this as one of the oldest sins in the garden, is that blame shifting. It's very detestable to the Lord. They're just masters at saying, but it's how I was raised, but you don't understand what I'm living with. My wife is borderline. They're just constantly able to point the blame away from themselves. And in a sense, this is where my heart really goes out to an oppressor, because they are so self-justifying. They don't see their deep need of Jesus. And this is where we need to be praying for them and seeking to reach them. We have the gospel is what they truly need, and they are people that is hard to reach. So if I were to summarize this up, I would say oppressors have this unique idolatry where they're actually usurping God's position, and they're living their life as if they are the one to be worshipped and obeyed. Think about how scary that is, right? It's only their rules that need to be followed. When you stir your tea, I don't want to hear your spoon clink. You can only wear light blue underwear. Your hair must never go below your chin. When you cook, if there's leftovers, I will throw them at you. Think of the pressures. I can't even be, so when there's rules, I have rules. I like my dishwasher loaded a certain way. I like all my little pink cups, I always say in this way. And my husband doesn't always agree. He likes to load his dishwasher a different way. But I don't throw the cup at him. I don't disparage him. No foul language comes out of my mouth. I don't use a Bible verse to shame him for not listening to me for the umpteenth time. I simply rearrange them. I laugh, or to say we have a joke, right? There are so many good ways to express disappointment. But one of the things to understand about abuse is when you hear a rule, be curious, find out if there are more. I remember one time I uncovered abuse because someone was saying to me, she was trying to get ready for her husband to come home and she was hosing off the driveway. I was like, why are you hosing off the driveway? Well, there's not allowed to be any dirt on it when my husband comes home. No dirt on the driveway. That's really interesting. I mean, we're lucky if we vacuum. I had like small kids at the time every night before my husband comes home. So I was like, does he have a lot of other preferences? Oh yes, there's gonna be no dog hair on the couches. Well, how many dogs do you have? We have 3 labs. Well, what's that like for you? Right? And so then just began unpacking and asking her, what are his other preferences? She wouldn't necessarily identify them as rules. So again, when you just hear something that's bizarre, you just ask questions. Again, it's only their words that need to be heard and obeyed. They often will interrupt. Or if there's a disagreement, they will not stop talking. They will wake up somebody in the middle of the night and lecture them for 2 hours. They will follow them around the house. If she's talking or bringing up a complaint, the eyes will be rolling, the sarcasm, just this constant dismissal. I don't need to listen to you, but you need to listen to me. It's only their emotions. Your friends make me feel uncomfortable. They're more educated than I am. I don't want to hang out with them, right? I don't want to hang out with your family because they have different politics, and it's upsetting to me. They really don't understand the impact of their behavior. They really don't have empathy for their spouse in any way. And it's only their physical and sexual needs that need to be met in the relationship, right? We talked a lot about preferences for what the home looks like, but there tends to be a lot of sexual caretaking in these relationships as well. When we think about this as whose rules, words, and do we have to obey? It's the Lord's, right? And so it's just such a distortion. And so I tend to think about oppression actually as an enforced worship, right? So they've so prioritized their own needs that the other person exists solely to fulfill their desires. And my friends, you cannot imagine what that looks like until you've talked to someone for an extended period of time and learned what that looks like, right? I have the right to the things I want, and I'm going to punish whoever stands in the way of my desires. In most oppressive marriages, it's something much more severe. Serve me or suffer the consequences. And these punishments are perpetually used to keep control. And I think that's just really important and yet confusing because we all have punishing behaviors, if we're honest, right? If I feel like my husband hasn't heard me or we're working through something, we were buying a house not long ago, and he likes these old farmhouses, and the thought of doing that again terrifies me, right? I'm like, how many times are we going to have this conversation? I can be really tempted to sit there and be silent. That's punishing. That's not engaging, right? And so we all have these ways when we're hurt that we either retreat or attack, and we're not nice, right? So when does the level of punishment rise to the level of abuse? And that's a really hard question, and I don't think it's easy to answer. I'm not a spanking parent. I always make that disclaimer, but I think it's the same thing as asking the question is, when is a spanking too hard, right? There's a lot. You have to think of a lot of factors. What was the age of the child? What was the infraction? Was there an implement used? Was there a mark left, right? It's the same thing for abuse. We have to stand back and look at the context and understand what's happening in the whole of the relationship. We typically are not looking for a one-off incident, although it can be enough, right? Someone can be beaten one time, choked one time, and then it's really clear. So sometimes abuse is really clear. I would say marital rape to me is really clear. But what about peeking, begging for sex, right? Not everybody in this room is going to have the same threshold of where something crosses the line into the land of abuse. And so we want to learn how different behaviors function in a relationship. And I think this is a good one to think about is we take the behavior of ignoring your wife, right? And how do we know if that behavior is actually abusive? You have to ask a lot of questions. One is, was it a punishment? If so, for what? Did he just have a really hard day at work? The phone was ringing off the hook. Everyone was complaining. He came home and he really just needed 20 minutes to cool down, right? And maybe he didn't handle it well and said, I had a rough day. He just goes into his office and closes the door, right? Maybe it wasn't executed well. but it wasn't necessarily a punishment. Or was it because he didn't like what was coming up on the weekend, and that his free time, he wasn't going to be able to go play golf because there was a family birthday party. So now he's choosing to ignore his spouse. So sometimes when you're in church, a woman will come up to you and she might say something like, is your husband ever jealous of your children? Right? And you might say, no, that's like a crazy question. Like, why are you saying that? Well, we don't typically say, well, why are you asking? Right? Or you might hear, does your husband ever ignore you? I might say, sometimes when he gets angry. That doesn't happen in my life, right? But some of you might. Or you might say, no, when he gets upset, this is what my husband does. We don't typically say, why are you asking? Right? So I'm trying to teach you to become curious. People are revealing details of their life because they're in distress. And so these are questions that you want to ask in that moment when someone's saying to you, yeah, my husband hasn't talked to me. So it would be another thing. You'd say, well, how often does this occur? How often is he ignoring you, right? The answer could be a couple times a month, a couple times a week, or this is the first time, right? The answers really matter. For how long? Yeah, when he talks to me, it's typically for 3 to 5 days. He doesn't say a word to me. Well, that's a problem, right? That's a little different than a 20-minute scenario. Well, what does he accomplish? When he's ignoring you, what does that do? Well, I know he's angry at me, and I work really hard. So next weekend, I'm going to make sure I don't have any plans on his calendar, so I'm not intruding in his world, right? It's conditional. She's learning. She's being trained by his behavior. What's the effect? When he ignores you, what's that like for you? I feel sick to my stomach. I'm nervous. I don't know how to ask him anything. I have to approach him about the school payment, but I don't know what to do with that because it's clear that he doesn't want me in his presence, right? And so now you're getting a sense of how fearful she is about relating to this person who's living with her. How does it change the wife's future behavior, right? So many women that I work with have learned, right, how to resist abuse, and that's becoming highly compliant people to the point that their bodies are collapsing. They're doing everything and anything they could do to serve and love their husbands well, and it's crushing them to live under the burden of keeping all these rules. When you're ignored, are you able to say to your spouse, express your hurt? Or when you do so, do you get further punishment? Right? I can say to my husband, when you said X, that really hurt me. And that's interesting to him. He cares for my heart. People who are in an abusive relationship, more punishment will be heaped on them when a complaint is brought forward. So again, these are just questions that help you go from that initial incident somebody's going to give you, saying this is happening in my marriage. You're going to become curious, asking more questions about it. Who repairs the relationship and why historically? Right? If abusers are blame shifters and blind, they're typically not going to be people who repent and apologize. And again, is it true repentance? Right? Oftentimes there'll be a blow up. Or we won't be talking for 5 days, and then a spouse will bring home flowers, or the switch will flip, and they'll just go back to acting totally normal. The relationship looks like it repairs. It's just that control is being reestablished by being nice. Right? There really isn't a true repair, as we would say a Christian relationship has to repair. So what I really want you to understand really is when we think about oppressive people, their hearts, the roots of what's going on in them is this self-worship. It's pretty deep, it's pretty entrenched, and it comes from this entitled heart that wants their world the way they want it. And what you're going to hear about is what a woman is saying to you, either about the control, all the ways that they're being controlled. It's usually going to come out in ways that you have to figure out the punishments that they're enduring at home. And people don't usually come up to you and say, my husband threw a mug at me. Or when we were in the car, he was upset with me, so he turned to right so hard my head slammed against the side of the car. They don't lead with that question, right? They don't reveal that detail. And so it's really just helpful to listen to people as they're bringing you a marriage problem. And I used to do this. People bring me a marriage problem, and I'd be so, like, this is easy. This is a budgeting issue. Let's get you a deacon. All you need to do is, right, I'm trying to solve the content of their disagreement without understanding the heart of what's going beyond into the disagreement. And so oftentimes we're so focused on the content of the argument, we forget to step back and ask, what does it look like? That argument actually look like? Is he standing over you when you're arguing? Are his fists clenched? I want to ask enough information that I know what it was like to be in that room. More of the screenplay. Content's important, but if I'm beginning to suspect abuse, I want to know what it was like, right? So I might say something, when he was angry with you, how did you know? Where were you when the argument was happening? We were in the kitchen. Were you sitting at a table? No, he had me cornered in the wall, right? You learn to ask different questions. It's one of the things I've done in my book, a little book out there, and there's dozens, hundreds of questions that help you ask good questions when you become to suspect abuse. Because it's hard to know what to ask. And so I just want us to think about the idea of enforced worship. And what we're looking for is these punishments, these controlling behaviors, and they're really easy because they're located in Scripture, right? These are just fruits that we see of a heart that is deceived and wants to control and oppress another person. It's just another way of seeing sin and understanding the unique idolatry behind it. And we should be able to map these things really easy into Scripture. So when I'm working with someone, I don't necessarily say to a man, I think you're an abuser, right? That would just be really hard. But tell me about the cruel things you say to your wife, right? Why do you have these preferences, right? I'm going to be really highly accurate. Bring them passages in Scripture that indict a particular behavior. And then I want to be really careful because we're going to encounter things that we might suspect to be abuse, but that actually aren't, right? Some people who live on the Asperger spectrum, they really struggle with connecting and being empathetic. And we want to be careful. Is this something that a spouse won't do, or is this something that's a true weakness and they need to be taught to do? Historical, I think of just different generations, right? I think about just different roles in the home. So is this just someone who comes home and that's what they've always seen? They come home as a husband and they can read the newspaper and doesn't care if there's 3 kids vomiting on the floor and they just don't know to jump in, right? They just didn't see it. And so they just need to be taught to live with their wife in an understanding way. We don't want to label that indifference as abuse. That just might have been something that they've seen. And then there's immaturity. So many in the younger generation now, the husbands are coming home and they're getting on the computer all night long and playing the video games. They don't understand that marriage creates a need to relate more. So again, we want to just be careful. Like, we're identifying these behaviors and they should be jarring to us, but we want to really understand what's going on. We want to be, is there really just entitlement can be behind video gaming, but is there this punishing blind, I don't care about my wife and that it's bothering her? Or when they're confronted are like, I didn't know that's the impact that it's having. I didn't think about that. Help me, right? That's a non-oppressive personality. And then we just want to say there's a spectrum of abusers. There's people who are entitled and really difficult. There's people who are manipulative and plotting, and they're like a chess master, and they're 3 steps ahead of their wife, and they've probably gone to everyone in the church already and told them their wife has a mental illness, so that she is discredited before she even comes forward. That happened in a church where I was working with the pastor, and it was another pastor on staff, and he had already laid all the groundwork. And he had said, my wife, I think she has a dissociative identity disorder. And so when she came forward to complain, she looked crazy, right? And it was really hard for this particular pastor to see it, till I said, does he sound like he's concerned about his wife? No. If you thought your wife had a mental illness, how would you be speaking about her? Would you be angry, or would you be broken? Right? And so then, again, we just become curious. And then there's people who are cruel and dangerous. I've counseled women who've had the sight of a gun pointed at them, Or they come home from work and they flip up all the lights and they army crawl through the house to terrorize their wives. That's happening. You call a shelter, you get help, right? That's just a highly dangerous situation. And I'm just bringing that up because we need to know what we don't know. We don't want to assume that there hasn't been a level of violence in the situation that you're working in that doesn't point to lethality. Again, in the book, there's a little danger assessment there. So just thinking about what is abuse. It's hard. We talk about domestic violence. It's a pattern of coercive and controlling abusive behavior to gain control over another behavior, and it comes in all forms. Typically, what I see when I counsel in Reformed congregations is very little physical abuse, or maybe there was a physical abuse incident one time in the past. What I tend to see 70% of the time is sexual abuse in marriage. And it is gross and it is disgusting, and I've debated, do I tell you the details this morning or not? But there usually is such a demand for sex, waking them up in the middle of the night, being violated in the middle of the night. And it's so confusing to women because they have been told that when marriage, this is a duty to be performed, and they don't even understand that it's okay to say, I have a headache, or we need to talk about working this out. And it is brutal. And I think about what that does to a person. If they're assaulted outside their home, you would never ask them to have breakfast with their rapist, right? And yet, I'm just bringing this up because this is what I see so often. That is what we do. We return people to a marriage, and a woman deteriorates and looks crazier and crazier and crazier because we're not understanding the intensity of what she's dealing with. And I see a lot of spiritual abuse, right? I see people misusing scripture, praying over their wives in horrific ways. And that's just what I tend to see in the Reformed world. Really quickly, I'm going to fly through a bunch of stuff here, okay? Domestic abuse stats, 25% of marriages are abusive. And what I think statistics help us do is they help us show patterns. I know statistics can be manipulated, and I'm not even saying believe the extent of them, cut them in half if that helps you. But what I want you to understand is the trends of the pervasiveness. 50% of the men who assault their wives also frequently assault their children. That shouldn't matter to us. Children in these homes. And sex assault, as I'm saying, occurs about 40% of the time in homes where there is abuse. And children are witnessing that assault about 20% of the time. Feel sick yet? Sadly, the statistics are the same in the Christian church, right? So if you had a church of 400 people, you would have 40 women in your congregation who would experience severe physical violence in their lifetime. You would have a handful of teenage girls experiencing dating violence. And you're going to have active abuse cases. And I thought, first time I came across a statistic, I had been counseling abuse for 10 years. And I was like, are they kidding me? And then I thought about my church of 400, and within 5 minutes I got there, right? I meet pastors all the time, and they say to me, well, it's not here. And I said, it's just a matter of finding it, right? You care for one victim well, the others are watching, and the rest will come out of the woodwork. And that's what happened in my church. We got a new pastor. My first call to him was about a marital rape. He cared for this woman so beautifully and tenderly, but within 2 years, there were 15 more cases because those women were watching. But the beauty of the gospel for those children, right, that watched a church do this well. And why do we care as a church? It's not just for the children and living out the integrity of the gospel in front of them. It's because that Christian women, when they seek help, they ordinarily consult with a pastor or a Christian woman in their congregation first. They float that little trial balloon. Does your husband want sex all the time? Is he jealous? Does he let you go to Bible study? Right? They ask these little questions. And what our first answer to them back largely dictates how they're going to walk out the next years of their lives. If we say go home and submit better, they will, much to their detriment. And so again, I'm just trying to paint the picture of serving a king versus being enslaved to a king. And I'm thinking you're getting that picture. And the beautiful words of the Lord, right? He wants people to be free so that they will serve him. In Exodus 3, we have this beautiful picture of the Lord saying, I have heard the cry of my people because I am their God, and I will deliver them from their taskmasters. right? The Lord came to deliver us from our sin. Amen, we all need it. But he also came to deliver us from the effects of other people's sin upon us. And when we encounter an oppressive marriage, we have to have that framework in mind. We can't just be saying to women, go home and serve better, right? It does not make things better. Right? We're going to look at a marriage and we're going to see it as two idols, two functioning, and we're going to say, you do this a little better and you do this a little better. But when someone is entitled and you're teaching their wife to serve them better, it just grows. I say it makes the monster grow. They're just going to want their wives to behave better. A friend of mine, her pastor told her, just have the house clean when your husband gets home, and then he won't do this. I've told women, bake cookies. Right? When you're going to have a tough conversation, she comes back, he threw them at me because I should have known his favorite flavor. So we have to understand the reality of what we're speaking to. In my book, I do Judges 9 and the parable of Jotham. It just talks about the brambles, these ever-increasing, dominating things. So what's it like for an oppressed person? They will feel owned. They will feel confused. Maybe I've had 4 women in the time that I have doing this coming to me and saying, I'm oppressed. They're mostly coming to me saying, I'm anxious. I don't love my husband enough. I'm struggling to be intimate with him. I don't respect him enough. I don't think I'm a good parent. They don't even understand what's happening to them because they're being told, this is your fault. You deserve this horrible behavior. They feel enslaved, crushed, alone, physically ill. Their bodies give out well before they understand what's happening to them. And then you'll have a few that are angry, right? They figured it out and they're mad, and just this guilt. And so when you see a woman coming before you, who are you going to empathize with, right? This man who has it all in control. He cares, takes of his image. He's beautiful and masterful in relationships. Or this woman who's breaking down. Her stories start not making sense. She seems oversensitive and complaining. And I just think that's a challenge to the church. We look at women and we say, we know what a godly woman's like. She's respectful, she's humble, she's secure in the Lord's love. But when we see a woman who's, right, fearful or nervous or disrespectful, we often label that as ungodly behavior. Which it is, I'm not saying that it isn't, but that we want to be curious when we don't see a presentation. We just don't want to miss it. We want victims to understand. We don't want to say just focus on your own sin, or you can't talk about your spouse without him present. They could never tell their stories if they did. And we don't want to minimize their cries for help. So many times I'll have an elder say, well, in my marriage, it's because they have no idea that their marriage looks nothing like the marriage that they're speaking into. So just ask, and ask. How did you provoke that, right? It's so easy to miss caring for a victim well. So I think I will close with this. Well, a couple thoughts, actually. These are just thoughts about what I would ask a woman if she's coming up to me and saying these things to me. How can you tell when your spouse is angry? Be specific. What does it look like? What is said? What is done? When you are talking about hard things, what are some of the ways disagreement is expressed? Do they mock you, walk away from you, roll your eyes? Are you afraid to disagree with your spouse? Tell me about that. What happens when you try to share a differing opinion? These aren't threatening questions. I'm not saying to them, are you being abused? They're not going to identify the word as abuse themselves. Does your spouse ignore you? If so, for what and how long? What happens if you let them down? Do you feel pressure to do things you don't want to do? And again, I'm bringing up sexually. You think about pornography is training men to objectify women and to desire bizarre things. Now, not all people who struggle with pornography are abusive, but they are this unique, both things are fueled by entitlement. And so if we're having an underground pornography problem, so if I'm going to find out a man is struggling with pornography, I'm screening for abuse. And if I find abuse, I'm screening for pornography, and then I'm going back and I'm doing sex abuse assessment, right? Do they remind you of times that they've sinned against them? Right. And then we begin to get answers. And I think it's really hard. And when you're working with an oppressed person, they really struggle with knowing who they are in the Lord. They don't know that they're God's chosen ones and that they're holy and they're beloved. And so we really need to help them understand how the Lord views them. They've lived with this distorted lens. And that's going to take a long time. It could take years, actually, before they even know how they should respond to it. And do they even have options? Right? What if they have a child with someone? Do you leave an abusive spouse and then share custody with someone who is cruel to your children? Leaving is the most dangerous time for a woman, right? So they begin to complain, they bring issues forward in the church, and then their lives get very difficult very quickly, and they're living with much more of a nightmare. So we really want to be mindful of the advice that we're giving. So I just really want to encourage you this morning about when you suspect that there's abuse, to be curious. And of course, we're looking at someone who is experiencing abuse. They're also sinning, right? They are not free from their own personal sin. But God is patient with us in our personal sin. And we want to be wise when we're going to bring something to the forefront. We want to make sure we're getting someone to safety. We want to understand and know their pain. And yet sometimes there is an immediate improvement to be made. Sometimes someone's drinking a little too much wine to go to bed with their spouse, right, so that they can handle what's going to happen upstairs. Sometimes they're nearing an emotional affair because their relationship is a desert and they're treated as a non-person at home. Those things we do address, right? I'm not saying that, but really we need to spend more time when we encounter some of these bizarre things addressing a person's safety and their particular sense of suffering. Yeah, and I think lastly, I'm already over my little time, I just want to say really clearly that oppression just violates God's design for marriage, doesn't it? He designed marriage to be this beautiful place of mutual trust, sacrifice, care, and honesty. And when oppressor makes it a place of domination, it turns everything upside down. And that makes it hard on the helper. It makes it hard on the session to have unity. It makes it hard on the children living in the midst of that. And so I just want to encourage wives, right? The scripture tells us to bring things into the light so that they can be redeemed, right? And oftentimes oppressed women, their sin is in remaining silent, right? They're putting up with, overlooking, don't want to expose what's happening in their home. But really our calling as spouses, both ways, is to help you know your spouse, know, love, and serve the Lord so that they can be more like Jesus, right? Jesus' love was sacrificing, right? He woos us with his gentle love. And it's just this precious thing. And so actually, an oppressor, you as a wife, you want to limit your spouse's ability to sin against you and resist their domination and expose their sin. Because in their redeemed self, they would thank you for helping you stop the damage of their heart and their call to be, as Christ would, love his church.